In the golden light of a Mississippi sunset, where twilight paints the sky in firelight and silence wraps the earth in reverence, something extraordinary stirs behind the fences of a wildlife sanctuary. A man returns from a long journey, dust-covered and weary, unaware that a pair of amber eyes has been waiting for him every single day. Most wild predators retreat from human touch, their survival instincts demanding distance. But Bella's no ordinary animal. She's the injured bobcat he had rescued months earlier. This is no ordinary reunion. When their paths cross again, what unfolds leaves even seasoned rescuers breathless and the toughest hearts undone. What is the power of a bond born in pain and nurtured in trust? And when the wild reaches out, not in fear but in love, how do you let go? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The late October sunset painted the Mississippi sky in hues of amber and gold as Jake Thornton's pickup truck rumbled down the gravel road toward Wild at Heart Rescue. The 34-year-old wildlife rehabilitator had been away at a conference in Arizona for the past week, leaving his dedicated team to care for the dozens of injured and orphaned animals that called the sanctuary home. As the familiar silhouette of the rehabilitation center emerged against the sunset, Jake felt a familiar tug at his heart. This place, with its collection of outdoor enclosures, medical facilities, and passionate staff, had been his life's work for the past decade. Jake parked his truck and breathed in the familiar scent of pine and damp earth that characterized this hidden corner of Van Cleve, Mississippi. A tall, weathered man with sun-creased eyes and calloused hands that betrayed years of gentle handling of wild creatures, Jake had earned a reputation throughout the Gulf Coast region as something of an animal whisperer. His uncanny ability to connect with even the most traumatized wild animals had made him a legend among wildlife rehabilitation circles. Sarah Miller, Jake's most trusted assistant and the sanctuary's head veterinarian, emerged from the main building as he grabbed his duffel bag from the truck. "Welcome back, stranger," she called, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. At 52, Sarah had the experience and steady hands that made her invaluable to their operation. "How was the conference?" Jake shrugged. "Same old talks about funding shortages and climate change impacts. Nothing we don't already know." He glanced toward the far enclosures. "How are our patients doing?" Sarah's expression softened. "Everyone's stable. The fox kits are ready for soft release next week. The barred owl's wing has healed nicely." She paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. "And Bella? Well, Bella's been restless since you left." At the mention of the bobcat, Jake's expression changed subtly. Bella had been his most challenging case in years. A female bobcat brought in 3 months ago after being struck by a vehicle on Highway 57. Her injuries had been severe: head trauma, internal bleeding, and a fractured leg. For days, they hadn't been sure she would survive at all. "Has she been eating?" Jake asked, concern etching his features. "Yes, but reluctantly. She's been pacing a lot, especially the last couple of days. Almost like she's been expecting something." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "Or someone." Jake nodded, trying to maintain professional detachment but failing miserably. "I'll check on her after I get settled in." "You might want to do that first," Sarah suggested. "None of us have been able to get close enough to properly examine her since you left. That bond you two have, it's something special, Jake." Inside the modest cabin that served as both his office and living quarters, Jake quickly unpacked his bag and changed into his familiar work clothes: faded jeans, a sturdy flannel shirt, and well-worn boots. His mind kept returning to Bella, the extraordinary Bobcat who had defied all expectations. The day Bella had arrived at Wild at Heart remained seared in Jake's memory. It had been a rainy July morning when the call came in. A female bobcat, badly injured and barely responsive, had been found by a local farmer at the edge of his property. Jake and Sarah had rushed to the scene, finding the magnificent creature sprawled on the wet grass, her tawny fur matted with blood, her breathing shallow and labored. "Looks like she was hit by a car," Sarah had murmured as they carefully assessed the animal's condition. "Probably wandered this far before collapsing." The bobcat had offered no resistance as they gently placed her on a stretcher and loaded her into their vehicle. A bad sign for a wild predator. Back at the sanctuary, X-rays and a thorough examination had confirmed their worst fears: severe head trauma, internal bleeding, and a complex fracture of the right hind leg. "It doesn't look good," Sarah had admitted as they prepped the animal for emergency surgery. "Even if she survives, there's no telling what kind of neurological damage she might have." For 3 days and nights, Jake had barely left the bobcat's side, monitoring her vital signs, administering fluids and medication, and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. On the 4th morning, when she had finally opened her eyes, amber orbs that seemed to pierce right through him, Jake had felt something shift between them, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. "Well, hello there," he had whispered, maintaining a respectful distance from the cage where she lay. "Welcome back to the land of the living." The bobcat had held his gaze for a long moment before closing her eyes again, but that brief connection had given Jake hope. He'd named her Bella, beautiful, because despite her injuries, there was an undeniable majesty to her. Recovery had been slow and fraught with setbacks. The head trauma had left Bella with occasional seizures, and the leg fracture had required a complex surgery and weeks of restricted movement. Throughout it all, Jake had been her constant companion, the only human she would allow to approach her enclosure without displaying signs of stress or aggression. Sarah had watched their growing bond with a mixture of professional interest and concern. "You're getting attached," she'd warned Jake one evening as he prepared Bella's meal with painstaking attention to detail. "Remember, the goal is to get her back to the wild." "I know what I'm doing, Sarah," Jake had replied, though he couldn't deny the truth in her words. Something about this particular animal had reached past his professional boundaries and touched something deeper. By the 2nd month, Bella had made remarkable progress. The seizures had decreased in frequency, and she had begun to put weight on her healed leg. She remained wary of other humans, but had developed what could only be described as a trusting relationship with Jake. She would come to the front of her enclosure when he approached, watch intently as he prepared her food, and even allow him to enter her space for necessary medical procedures without the usual stress response. It was unprecedented in their experience with bobcats, which typically remained fiercely independent and stressed in captivity, regardless of how long they stayed. But Bella was different. The severe trauma she had experienced seemed to have altered something fundamental in her relationship with humans, or at least with this one human. The staff had begun to joke that Jake had finally met his match. "She's got you wrapped around her paw." Tim Reynolds, one of the younger volunteers, had teased after watching Jake spend an hour sitting quietly near Bella's enclosure, just keeping her company. Jake had shrugged off the comments, but privately, he couldn't deny the unique connection. In his 15 years of wildlife rehabilitation work, he had never experienced anything quite like it. Now, as he walked the familiar path toward the bobcat enclosures at the back of the property, Jake felt a flutter of anticipation. The structure that housed Bella was specially designed for recovering predators. A spacious area with both indoor and outdoor sections, natural features like logs and rocks for climbing, and privacy screens that limited human visibility and disturbance. As he approached, Jake could hear Sarah and Tim talking in low voices near the observation window. "She's been like this all day," Tim was saying. "Pacing, listening. It's like she knows something we don't." "She always was too smart for her own good," Sarah replied with a hint of affection in her voice. They both turned as Jake rounded the corner. Tim, a lanky college student studying wildlife biology, grinned widely. "The prodigal father returns," he joked. "Your furry daughter's been driving us crazy." Jake rolled his eyes at the comment but couldn't suppress a smile. "How crazy are we talking?" "See for yourself," Sarah said, gesturing toward the observation window. Inside the enclosure, Bella was indeed pacing. The bobcat moved with remarkable grace considering her previous injuries, her muscular body flowing in the fluid motion characteristic of her species. Her tufted ears were erect and swiveling, and her tail twitched with apparent agitation. "She started this morning," Tim explained, "just pacing and listening, barely touched her breakfast." Jake watched the bobcat for a moment longer, noting her improved mobility and the healthy sheen of her coat. Despite her apparent restlessness, she looked good, a far cry from the broken creature they had brought in 3 months ago. "I'll go in," he decided. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You just got back. Maybe give it a day, let her settle." "She'll settle better once she knows I'm back," Jake said with quiet confidence. "You said yourself she's been waiting." After gathering a few supplies, a piece of fresh rabbit meat as a peace offering and the medical kit for a quick assessment, Jake approached the double-door entry system that allowed safe access to the enclosure. He followed the protocols they had established for Bella, announcing his presence with a soft, distinctive whistle before entering the first door, then waiting for her to acknowledge him before proceeding through the second. He whistled softly as he entered the first chamber, then peered through the reinforced glass of the inner door. Bella had stopped pacing and stood perfectly still in the center of the enclosure, her entire body alert, ears trained toward the sound. "Hey, Bella," Jake called softly. "It's just me. I'm back." The change in the bobcat was immediate and dramatic. Her ears flattened slightly, not in aggression, but in what Jake had come to recognize as her gesture of recognition. She took several steps toward the door, her amber eyes fixed intently on the sound of his voice. Jake entered slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening as he always did. But this time, something was different. Instead of maintaining her usual cautious distance, Bella approached him directly, her gaze never leaving his face. "Easy, girl," he murmured, crouching down to her level. "Easy now." What happened next would be etched in the memories of everyone at Wild at Heart for years to come. The bobcat closed the distance between them and, with a small chirping sound that Jake had never heard her make before, pressed her head against his outstretched hand. Through the observation window, Sarah gasped audibly. Tim fumbled for his phone, desperate to document the unprecedented interaction. Inside the enclosure, Jake remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as Bella rubbed her cheek against his palm in a gesture startlingly similar to a domestic cat's greeting. "Well, hello to you too," Jake whispered, emotion thickening his voice. "Did you miss me?" As if in answer, Bella circled him once, her tail brushing against his legs, before coming to rest against his side. Slowly, with infinite care, Jake brought his hand to the scruff of her neck, gently stroking the thick fur there. The bobcat leaned into his touch, her eyes half closing in apparent contentment. For several minutes, they remained like that. The hardened wildlife rehabilitator and the wild predator, connected by something that defied easy explanation. When Jake finally shifted position, intending to conduct his examination, Bella surprised him again. She rose on her hind legs, placing her front paws on his shoulders in a move that brought their faces close together. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed from the observation window. "Jake, be careful." But Jake knew, with a certainty that transcended rational explanation, that he was in no danger. Bella wasn't threatening him. She was greeting him in the most intimate way she knew how. Her face was inches from his, her whiskers nearly touching his cheek, and then, in a gesture that would later bring tears to the eyes of everyone who viewed Tim's shaky video footage, she rested her head briefly on his shoulder. The moment lasted only seconds before Bella dropped back to all fours, but its significance was profound. Through the observation window, Sarah wiped at her eyes, not bothering to hide her emotion. Even Tim, usually quick with a joke, was silent, his phone still recording the extraordinary scene. Inside the enclosure, Jake struggled to maintain his professional composure. The Bobcat's gesture had pierced straight through to his heart, awakening feelings he usually kept carefully controlled in his work. He knew the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals, of projecting human emotions onto creatures that operated by very different rules. And yet, in that moment, the connection between them felt undeniably real. "Let's have a look at you," he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion as he began his assessment. Remarkably, Bella submitted to his examination with unprecedented cooperation, allowing him to check her healed leg, examine her eyes and ears, and even open her mouth to inspect her teeth and gums. Her behavior was so un-Bobcat-like that it would have concerned Jake in other circumstances, but he could detect no signs of physical distress or illness. If anything, she seemed more at ease than he had ever seen her. When he finally rose to leave, Bella followed him to the door, pressing against his legs in a gesture eerily reminiscent of a pet seeing its owner off. The parallel was unsettling, given everything Jake knew about wild bobcat behavior. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. "We need to start talking about your future, girl." Outside the enclosure, Sarah and Tim waited with expressions that mingled amazement and concern. "I've never seen anything like that," Sarah said, shaking her head. "In 30 years of wildlife medicine, never." Tim held up his phone. "I got it all on video. This is going to break the internet." Jake frowned. "No posts, Tim. This isn't a circus, and she's not a performer." The younger man looked crestfallen but nodded his understanding. Wild at Heart had strict policies about sharing images of their animals, designed to prevent the glorification of wild creatures as pets or entertainment. "The bond you've formed," Sarah began, then hesitated. "Jake, it's remarkable, but it complicates things." Jake knew exactly what she meant. Their goal from the beginning had been to rehabilitate Bella and return her to the wild. That was the mission of Wild at Heart, to heal and release, not to tame or domesticate. The attachment Bella had formed to him could jeopardize her ability to survive independently. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said, more sharply than he intended. But as he walked back to his cabin that evening, the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. Bella's extraordinary greeting, the way she had recognized him, welcomed him, even showed what appeared to be affection, was both a miracle and a potential tragedy. In helping her heal physically, had he inadvertently created a psychological dependency that would prevent her return to the wild? The following weeks brought both joy and heartache as Jake faced the growing dilemma of Bella's future. Her physical recovery was now complete. The fractures had healed, the neurological symptoms had resolved, and her strength and coordination had returned to normal. By all medical measures, she was ready for release. But her behavior told a different story. While she maintained appropriate wariness around other humans, with Jake, she displayed a level of trust and attachment that was entirely abnormal for her species. She greeted him enthusiastically each morning, sought physical contact during his visits, and showed visible distress when he left her enclosure. "We have to start the pre-release protocol," Sarah insisted during a tense staff meeting in early November. "She needs to be weaned off human contact, Jake. You know that better than anyone." He did know. The standard protocol for predator rehabilitation involved a gradual reduction in human interaction, transitioning to remote feeding and monitoring, and eventually moving the animal to a pre-release enclosure with minimal human visibility. But every time Jake considered implementing these measures with Bella, something in him resisted. "She's different," he argued, though he knew how it sounded. The head trauma, the prolonged recovery, she's formed attachments that aren't typical for her species. "All the more reason to start the process now," Sarah countered gently. "The longer this goes on, the harder it will be, for both of you." The truth of her words stung, but Jake couldn't deny their wisdom. With reluctance, he agreed to begin the pre-release protocol the following week. That Friday evening, he spent an extra hour with Bella, sitting quietly in her enclosure as the autumn sun set beyond the pine trees that surrounded the sanctuary. The Bobcat lay beside him, occasionally pressing her head against his hand in what had become her habitual gesture of connection. "Things are going to change, girl," he told her softly, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping somehow she might sense their meaning. "You were never meant to stay here. You belong out there, under the open sky, hunting, living as you were meant to live." Bella blinked up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. In moments like these, Jake could almost believe she understood everything. The dilemma, the necessity of separation, even the pain it would cause them both. "I'm going to miss you," he admitted, the words catching in his throat. "But this is how it has to be." As darkness fell, he reluctantly left her enclosure, steeling himself for the weeks ahead. The pre-release protocol began on Monday. Jake forced himself to limit his visits to Bella's enclosure to brief, functional interactions, delivering food without speaking or making eye contact, quickly cleaning the space while she was sequestered in the indoor portion, conducting necessary medical checks with professional detachment. The Bobcat's confusion and distress were evident. She would approach the door expectantly when she heard his footsteps, only to be met with his deliberate coldness. She would attempt to initiate contact, pressing against the mesh barrier that now separated them during feeding times, making the soft, chirping sound that had become her signature greeting. Each time, Jake would turn away, his heart breaking at her bewilderment. "You're doing the right thing," Sarah assured him after a particularly difficult day when Bella had refused to eat. "This is what she needs to survive in the wild." Jake nodded, unable to articulate the doubt and guilt that plagued him. What if Bella was truly different? What if, due to her trauma and prolonged rehabilitation, she had developed a genuine need for human connection? Was he condemning her to a lonely, confused existence in the name of a natural life that might no longer be natural for her? By the third week of the protocol, Bella's behavior had begun to change. The attempts at connection grew less frequent. She stopped approaching the door at the sound of footsteps. She retreated to the far corners of her enclosure during cleaning and feeding times. To anyone else, these changes would have seemed like progress, signs that she was reverting to appropriate wild behavior. But Jake, who knew her better than anyone, saw something else in her demeanor. Not a return to wildness, but a shutting down. The light in her amber eyes had dimmed. Her movements, once fluid and purposeful, had become mechanical. She ate because she had to, not because she wanted to. She existed, but she no longer seemed to engage with her surroundings. "She's depressed," he told Sarah one evening, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "We're breaking her spirit, not preparing her for the wild." Sarah studied him with concern. "Jake, you're projecting human emotions onto her. Bobcats don't get depressed. They adapt to changing circumstances. That's what she's doing." "Then why isn't she eating properly? Why has she stopped grooming? Why does she just lie there for hours staring at nothing?" Jake demanded, his frustration boiling over. "If that's not depression, what would you call it?" Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'd call it an animal struggling with change, which is normal. But Jake, this is about more than Bella, isn't it? This is about you too." The perceptiveness of her comment struck him silent. She was right, of course. The bond with Bella had become something precious to him, a connection that filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged in his life. Living in the remote sanctuary, dedicating himself to the animals in his care, Jake had gradually distanced himself from human relationships. Bella, with her unexpected attachment and trust, had awakened something in him, a need for connection that went beyond professional purpose. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, the confession costing him. "I don't know what's right anymore." Sarah squeezed his arm. "Sleep on it. We'll figure it out together." That night, unable to rest, Jake found himself drawn back to the rehabilitation center. The November air was crisp, a hint of frost glittering on the grass as he made his way to Bella's enclosure. Through the observation window, he could see her lying in her favorite spot on the raised platform, her eyes open but unfocused, her posture unnaturally still. Making a decision that went against every protocol and professional boundary, Jake entered the enclosure. At the sound of the door, Bella's head lifted slightly, but she made no move to approach him as she once would have. "Hey girl," he said softly, crossing the space to sit near her platform. "I've missed you." For a long moment, the Bobcat merely stared at him, as if trying to reconcile his presence with the cold distance of recent weeks. Then, slowly, she rose and descended from her perch. She approached him cautiously, her movements hesitant, until she stood just beyond his reach. Jake extended his hand, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I was doing what was best for you." Bella sniffed his fingers, then, in a movement that brought tears to Jake's eyes, pressed her head against his palm. The gesture of trust and forgiveness was so pure, so undeserved, that he had to bite his lip to maintain his composure. They sat together through the small hours of the morning, the man and the Bobcat, reconnecting in a silence that held more meaning than words could express. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Jake made a promise, to Bella, to himself, and to whatever force had brought them together. "We'll find another way," he vowed, "a way that honors who you are and what you need." The solution, when it finally emerged, was both obvious and revolutionary. Jake presented it at an emergency staff meeting the following day, his voice steady with newfound conviction. "We create a sanctuary space for her," he proposed. "Not a cage, Not a temporary rehabilitation enclosure, but a permanent territory. Something that gives her freedom, autonomy, the ability to live as a wild bobcat, but within a protected environment where she can maintain human connection if she chooses to. Sarah's initial skepticism was evident. "You're talking about keeping her indefinitely?" "Jake, that goes against everything we stand for." "Does it?" he challenged. "Our mission is to give injured wildlife the best possible chance at a fulfilling life. For most animals, that means complete rehabilitation and release. But Bella isn't most animals. Her injuries, her prolonged recovery, the bond she's formed, these have created unique needs." Tim, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "It could work. We have those 10 acres at the back of the property, the area we've been planning to expand into. It's already partially fenced. With some modifications, it could become a secure territory. And it would give us an opportunity to study long-term rehabilitation outcomes in traumatic brain injury cases," added Dr. Melissa Chen, a wildlife neurologist who occasionally consulted on complex cases. There's very little research on how these injuries affect wild animal behavior and adaptation over time. Gradually, the conversation shifted from whether they should create a sanctuary space for Bella to how they would implement it. The logistics were complex: securing funding for the necessary infrastructure, designing a space that would meet a bobcat's natural needs while ensuring she couldn't escape into surrounding areas, developing protocols for limited human interaction that would support her well-being without reinforcing unhealthy dependencies. By the end of the meeting, a plan had taken shape. They would create what they began calling the Bella Sanctuary, a multi-acre enclosed territory with natural features, hunting opportunities in the form of a controlled prey population, and minimal but consistent human presence. Jake would remain her primary caretaker, but other staff would be trained to interact with her safely, ensuring she wouldn't become entirely dependent on one person. "This isn't a solution we'd recommend for most cases," Sarah emphasized as they wrapped up the discussion. "But for Bella, with her unique history and needs, I think it might be the most humane option." The transformation of the back acreage into Bella's sanctuary became a community effort. Local businesses donated materials, volunteers helped clear brush and construct natural features, and a fundraising campaign exceeded their goals within weeks. By mid-December, the space was ready. A slice of Mississippi wilderness enclosed by specialized fencing, complete with a small stream, rock formations for climbing, dense undergrowth for stalking and hiding, and a simple observation cabin where staff could monitor without intrusion. The day of Bella's transfer arrived with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. No one could predict how she would respond to this new environment, whether she would embrace the expanded territory or become overwhelmed by the sudden freedom. Jake prepared for the transfer with meticulous care, ensuring everything was in place to make the transition as stress-free as possible. In the end, it was Bella herself who made the moment unforgettable. Released from her transport crate at the edge of her new territory, she emerged cautiously, taking in the sights and scents of the unfamiliar space. For several minutes, she remained close to Jake, occasionally glancing back as if seeking reassurance. Then, with a grace that took his breath away, she took her first steps into her new domain. She moved slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, investigating the stream, climbing a fallen log, disappearing briefly into the underbrush only to re-emerge on a rocky outcropping. From this vantage point, she surveyed her territory, her posture alert and engaged in a way Jake hadn't seen since before the pre-release protocol. "She looks like a wild bobcat again," Sarah murmured from beside him. "You were right, Jake. This is what she needed." The following weeks brought a transformation in Bella that validated their unconventional decision. She established patterns within her territory, created preferred resting spots, and began to hunt the small prey that had been introduced to the enclosure. Her physical condition improved further, her coat regaining its glossy sheen, her movements becoming more fluid and powerful. Yet the most remarkable aspect was the balance she seemed to find between her wild nature and her connection to humans, particularly to Jake. When he visited the observation cabin, she would often appear, approaching with a dignified awareness of her own autonomy. Sometimes she would keep her distance, acknowledging his presence with nothing more than a steady gaze from across a clearing. Other times, she would come close, even initiating the physical contact that had defined their earlier relationship. "It's like she's figuring out who she is," Tim observed after watching one such interaction. "Part wild bobcat, part something else." Jake nodded, watching as Bella disappeared back into the underbrush. She's defining her own terms, making her own choices about how to live and who to trust. In that sense, perhaps Bella had achieved the most authentic form of wildness after all. Not the prescribed isolation of a creature who had never known human contact, but the conscious independence of one who had experienced connection and chosen how much of it to maintain. As winter softened into spring, the Bella Sanctuary became not just a home for one extraordinary bobcat, but a symbol of wild at heart's evolving philosophy. That true rehabilitation meant honoring the individual needs and experiences of each animal, even when those needs defied conventional categories of wild versus tame. For Jake, the journey with Bella had transformed not only his professional approach, but his understanding of connection itself. Through her, he had learned that the bonds we form, whether between species or within them, are not weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths to be honored. That vulnerability and attachment, far from diminishing wildness, can sometimes be the very things that allow it to flourish in its most authentic form. On a warm April evening, as the Mississippi twilight painted the sanctuary in shades of gold and shadow, Jake sat on the porch of the observation cabin, watching as Bella hunted in the tall grass nearby. Her movements were poetry, powerful, precise, fully embodying the majesty of her species. Yet when she paused, catching his scent on the breeze, the look she gave him held a recognition that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild. In that moment, Jake understood that some connections defy explanation, but deserve protection nonetheless. Bella had never been and would never be a pet. But in her own bobcat way, she had chosen him as part of her world, just as he had chosen her. And in that mutual choosing, that reciprocal act of trust and recognition, there was a kind of wildness all its own, raw and true and worthy of preservation. As darkness fell over the sanctuary, Bella disappeared into the shadows, sovereign in her domain. But Jake knew she would return in her own time, on her own terms. And in that certainty, there was a peace that felt both earned and gifted, a testament to the healing power of love, patience, and the courage to forge new paths when old ones prove insufficient.